would take questions. How are we doing on time? Is it?
You're fine.
Fine still? Okay, well, one more thing I wanted to talk about was the effects, which I said are varied. This book over here, The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience by Ariel Masters and Gene Houston, which is named for another book that's kind of a famous psychology book called The Varieties of Mystical Experience, but this one's called The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, and it's just a model that they started developing for how these compounds have effects on us. No one really, knew very much about them back then. It was really, it's hard to describe how it was back then because it was just first starting out. No one knew whether they were good, they were bad, whether they were harmful, whether they were helpful. People were trying to research it, and these researchers started developing models, like any psychologist would try to do. This book here is by J. Stevens, and that is a good history of the 60s. It's kind of interesting that it ends in 1970, which is kind of when the counterculture ended, although there was trails of it into the 70s. It pretty much ended a few years after LSD was made illegal. It was basically effectively the government was able to stop the distribution of the stuff. That's been that case ever since. There's been people interested in it, but it's gone from being sort of like back then it was a movement, and now it's more like stamp collecting. People talk about, having, later on they started making LSD into blotters. People have collections of, LSD blotters, but it's really something that is difficult to become a participant in the movement of when the stuff is so highly illegal. They actually sentenced a guy who made it to life imprisonment. So it's a very, very serious crime. Now, going back to the experiences, like I said, they can be everything from heaven to hell and in between. Actually, Huxley, who wrote Doors of Perception, he also, his sequel to that book was called Heaven and Hell. And so it can be very heavenly. Like this artist is evoking some of the more like spiritual or archetypal types of experiences that you see that people, there were a lot of artists in the 60s who became noteworthy, who were influenced by LSD, just like the rock music was very much, from the 60s, was very much influenced by LSD. There was also a movement of art, psychedelic art in the 60s as well. Some of these, are translating very well here, from this book called Psychedelic Art, actually, which is also by Gene Masters in Houston, the ones who did the Varieties of Psychedelic Experience. This is a giant mandala, which is actually a giant painting, kind of like this picture actually doesn't do justice to it very well here. But in any event, so the experiences can be really, really wide, and they can also be, I'm saying that they can be heavenly, but they can also be very hellish, so they can be very bad. And there's one theory that was developed to try to understand its use is called what they call setting. So, and the way it was developed, the theory was developed was that they did this experiment, a social psychology experiment, where they took people in an office, like a waiting room, waiting to see a doctor, and they gave them amphetamines, but they gave some people amphetamines and some people not amphetamines. And then they had other people who came in the room and either were very anxious and afraid, acting crazy, or they were very happy and euphoric. And what they found is that the people who were waiting to see the doctor, would either be really, get really happy and euphoric, and or really, depressed and anxious, or even start acting crazy. because of the mental set that these other people were producing. So, so the effects of other people, the effects of your environment, all of those types of things are reflected in the psychedelic experience. Then, of course, you know, like I said before, one extra ingredient, which isn't really talked about in Sentence Setting, which is the drugs themselves. And each drug is very specific. Now, I wrote a book, Kelly mentioned it, I think, at the beginning about MDMA. You know, MDMA is not specifically a psychedelic drug. It's kind of a, they call it an pathogen or adaptogen. It doesn't produce profound visual and mental, you know, profound visual changes as these, what they call the classical psychedelics, which we looked at the beginning, psilocybin, mescaline, and LSD. But they produce very empathetic and ecstatic types of experiences without visual changes. Now, at the beginning, you know, they before they called LSD was called a psychedelic. It was named by Hoffer and Osmond, and they kind of went back and forth, you know, when they were looking at mescaline at the beginning there. And the word means to evoke a experience of the soul, to open up the soul. Now, before that, they were called hallucinogens, but they were also called psychomimetics at the beginning, you know, which are things that make you crazy. And some of the earliest studies of them were actually, they said they were looking to see if they could find some relationship between you know, psychedelics and mental illnesses. They found that there was no relationship between them. But in the process, these researchers back in those days would do all kinds of, you know, unusual things, like give them to mental patients, and sometimes with bad results, sometimes with good results. But there were many, many, many studies that have been done. There's like thousands and thousands of studies that were done, but they were all stopped back in 1966. And there have been very few studies, you know, in the literature since then. Most of the studies that you can find about them are pretty much anecdotal studies, you know, of people who've had experiences and published about them, or published their own theories, or whatever. But very little research has been done. There's a group called MAPS, started by Rick Doblin, that's looking into trying to get research going again with it, but he hasn't had much luck. There's been maybe 1 or 2 studies where maybe 3 or 4 people have taken it, but there's been a little bit more research in Europe, because the United States is particularly crazy about letting people do research with it. You have to have an armed guard present 24 hours a day to guard the LSD. It's pretty costly. You have to get, you know, raise a lot of money just to do the research, right? So most of the stuff that you've heard about since then is anecdotal. When people tell you about it, you know, what you read about it is people's experiences, but it's not, you know, necessarily the same as research. But research really, there's been, like I said, you know, there's been a lot of things discovered about it, but there's a great deal that still remains to be understood about it. I think that in the future, when we lose our, you know, fears about these things, it's kind of like when, you know, when Prometheus discovered fire, you know, back in the myth, you know, the myth of how fire was discovered. There was this guy named Prometheus, you know, who discovered fire, and when Prometheus was found out about by the gods, and, you know, he was chained to a rock, you know, and, you know, his liver was pecked out by birds, you know, for eternity. You know, he was suffered because he had revealed fire, you know. But later on, you know, after you know, that people started getting interested in fire and using it, and now fire is pretty well understood and has become part of the way that our society is. You know, we wouldn't do very well without it. But it, you know, that was the, you know, the original story about it was